Greetings, fellow seekers, and welcome to the captivating Psychonaut Café podcast, where we embark on a thrilling voyage through the uncharted waters of psychedelics and their use in celebratory ceremonies. I'm your guide, Sergio, and today we're diving into the enigmatic, transformative, and enlightening realm of psychedelics, with a particular focus on their use in celebration versus healing ceremonies. Alongside me is a cherished companion, someone I met during my own exploration in the psychedelic realm. He brings a truly captivating and powerful insight on these ceremonial substances. So without further ado, let's embark on this extraordinary adventure. All right, so before we begin our discussion, I'd like to please ask you to introduce yourself. So just let the audience know who you are and also what is your connection to the psychedelic world.
Good afternoon, Sergio. My name is Michael, and my connection to the psychedelic world is long and broken. I started with psychedelics back in when I was living in Iowa, around 91, 92. My evil twin, yes, I'm the good one. My evil twin introduced me to psychedelics. And then after college, after I left Iowa in probably 93, 94, I had completely stopped psychedelics, stopped all drugs of all kinds, and I didn't pick it back up until just a few years ago, probably 2020. And it's like I've lived two separate lives with psychedelics.
Interesting. So you're the first times or when you began your journey with the use of psychedelics, would you say that it was more on a recreational aspect, celebratory, or were you really looking to heal or were just experimenting?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, back then, the there was no real not well, there was no real healing scene for psychedelics. It was the early 90s. The rave scene was very strong. I was a raver, and my first psychedelic experience was with mushrooms. I don't remember how much we took. It was like half a dinner plate. So I'm
Damn.
thinking it was probably, yeah. But I was living in a place in Iowa called Fairfield, and there was a meditation retreat school ashram there by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the guru who took the Beatles to India and introduced them to TM, Transcendental Meditation, all that. So it was a very spiritual hippie community. And so I was already doing the spiritual work through meditation, the quote unquote healing work, we weren't calling it that, through learning tarot reading and all of this various new age spiritual stuff. So for me, the psychedelics, the mushrooms, the acid, and we were doing everything back then. I was 20 years old, first time out of the house, and I went nuts to the point where Jim Morrison came back from the dead at one point and told me, "Kid, chill."
I'm sure I'm sure Jim and many others were probably coming around saying, listen, relax there, buddy.
Yeah, they were.
So listen, what would you say are the primary differences between the use of psychedelics in a celebratory or recreational aspect versus, let's say, using them for healing or maybe even therapeutic reasons?
Well, that's one thing I noticed when I got back into psychedelics this time around 2020. I noticed that the vibe had completely changed. And now the focus is on the healing and the shadow work and the healing. And did I mention the healing? Oh, and there's also the healing. So, and people seem to be hyper focused on that. And we seem to have lost the celebration. I mean, psychedelic experiences that I'm usually seeing now are shamanic led, and they talk about, the inner child, the wounded child, the healing and the soul work and the shadow work. And, most of the group psychedelic events or ceremonies, you sit in the circle, you take your mushrooms or your whatever plant medicine you're using, and you sit there on your mat and you go internal and you work on your healing. And that's great. That's a great thing to do. We all need healing. We all need growth. But it seems that we've forgotten the fun in these plant medicines. I mean, these things can show us aspects of ourselves, aspects of the universe. They can take us out into the cosmos. They can make music amazing. They make colors the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. And right now, it seems like nobody's just going out and having fun. I mean, these plants are uh, give us some of the best experiences in our life. And there's a faction, and I hate to call it that, but there's a faction of the psychedelic community that really looks down on people who, for example, go to a music festival and drop some acid, like, oh, they're doing it wrong. We're ever so much better than them. We've actually developed a culture of psychedelic snobbery.
Right, and I think there's a stigma, and I think that the main reason, from my perspective anyway, is that there is not enough information available to better understand these different tools that are given to us. It's just like a hammer. You can use it to do some good positive work, but you can also use it to do some pretty bad stuff. So people have this tendency of stigmatizing certain things, and then we lose a little bit of the interest in other benefits that this could bring us. So I totally am in agreement with what you said, and I think that that's something that maybe needs to be analyzed and discussed a little bit more. But that being said, like since there's like possible stigma and maybe like a bad rap for these things, what are some of the potential risks or drawbacks that you would say using psychedelics solely for celebratory purposes, and can they be mitigated? Because this comes back to the statement you were making, where people are no longer using these substances like to enjoy, but obviously because there's probably been abuse. But what would you think are the potential risks and drawbacks?
There's a number of them. I mean, as I've mentioned in various discussions in group meetings and with you, we absolutely need to be responsible. But we're forgetting why we're doing this. If we lose the celebration, then this becomes boring. I mean, I swear if I have to go through one more shamanic healing, I'm going to blow my brains out. But the risks that go with the recreational or the party use are varied. One, generally for these substances themselves, acid, mushrooms, things like that, there's very little physical risk. An overdose on mushrooms or acid just means you're probably going to have a more difficult trip. But there's no real physical danger, but there is a psychological danger. Some people can't handle what they're shown on on these trips. So you need to find the balance. It's like we've talked about with the various pillars on, or the two pillars on the tree of life, the pillar of severity, the pillar of mercy, which we'll get into when we talk about magic on another podcast. But if you only have the pillar of mercy, you're weak. If you only have the pillar of strength, then you're too severe. So we need to find the balance between the celebration and this more serious healing shamanic aspects. So there's also the risk in the party scene of going beyond psychedelics into the more physically addictive drugs. It can very easily go from partying with mushrooms and acid into partying with heroin, cocaine, and that these days even fentanyl or meth, because those are also in the party scene. So it's hard to separate the psychedelic party scene from the hard drug party scene, which can get very ugly very quickly. But for the psychedelics themselves, I mean, as everybody always talks about, set and setting. So I don't recommend anything, but if I were to recommend something, I would recommend, getting a couple of good friends together and maybe having some mushrooms and going to the park and, looking at the pretty flowers and the clouds and the trees, just enjoying instead of just sitting there gazing at your own navel and contemplating, how hard you've had it spiritually, how rough your life was, because that can get real depressing real quick, and people don't want to do that. They're willing to do that if they also get the beauty side of it as well, if they get to see the pretty colors, if they get to have the great emotions, if they get to see the universe in a whole new light.
Right. And I think that's a very interesting point because ceremonially speaking, as you stated, there's been a lot of ceremony emphasis or emphasis on ceremonies that are primarily geared towards healing trauma, and that's something that we're aware of, we're familiar with, and we're very pro that aspect. Of course, this is something that, especially in the context of legalizing these substances, this is something that's very crucial to the understanding of what these plant medicines can do for us. However, looking back on history and tracking down a little bit more on the context of like the Eleusinian mysteries and whatnot, really interesting facet where I believe there's also space to create enjoyment or recreational ceremonies, as you stated. Of course, I think it would take more of a context where you would have to have a really organized environment, just like you would have in an organized therapeutic ceremony. I think there's room to have an organized celebratory ceremony where you could have specific event geared in the purpose of with the right people in the right setting. Because as you said, no one can really get hurt. But I mean, if you're, manipulating a really heavy machinery while you're dropping acid or while you're doing psychedelics, of course, that's not a good thing because you can effectively hurt yourself or people out there can get hurt. So this is
Oh,
kind of
exactly.
the disclaimer I reckon. But I am in agreement with what you're stating. I think that there is room to maybe analyze and basically look into a more celebratory kind of environment in these to really appreciate the beauties and the mysteries that life has to offer us. So one of the things too that brings me to another question, which is, would you are you aware of any cultural or historical examples of psychedelics being used for celebratory or even maybe healing purposes that can provide any insight on the respective benefits and risks?
Good question. I mean, culturally, not so much. I have seen some ayahuasca groups that do some variation of the Santo Daime um, paradigm, where I think they call it Umbanda. We have some friends that would be able to give us more light on that. But from what I understand, there's drumming and music, and it's an ayahuasca ceremony where you're not just sitting there on your mat and dealing with the purging and the rough time. And that sounds like something that I would definitely want to learn more about. And culturally, in general, I mean, the rave scene um, was for a while I think a good use, even calling back to the Eleusinian mysteries and even more the Dionysian mysteries, where the Dionysians back in Greece, their main path to enlightenment was through delirium and madness. And so they would, I mean, everyone associates Dionysus with alcohol, which was part of it, but they were doing alcohol and they were smoking cannabis and they were doing some sort of hallucinogen. We think it was probably some sort of mushroom concoction or possibly an ergot concoction. Hard to really know for sure. But the Dionysians, they tried to achieve enlightenment, spiritual growth through excess. And that translated eventually into the Roman orgies, which were more than just sex. It was a lot of food. It was excess in every way. And that is one path to enlightenment. It's a dangerous path because it's very easy to get lost and get caught up in this world, caught up in the great food and the good feelings. So, and that brings me back to my previous point. We need to find the balance. So the rave scene can go too far. The Dionysian scene can go too far, but and that leads to excess. Whereas the healing shamanic scene cannot go far enough, and that leads to boredom and people giving up on this great work that we're all looking to do.
Right. And I think that's the really interesting aspect is to understand culturally how this has been a part of human experience, even to the aspect of understanding why we have these particular receptors in our brains for these particular plants that exist. And coming back to the point that you were making about the Eleusinian mysteries and the Dionysian mysteries, which is interesting because there was technically, upon from my understanding, there was no word for alcohol. They attribute a lot of these ceremonies attributed to alcohol, but there was no word for alcohol. Alcohol was actually an Arabic word that came from alcohol or something like that, which, as I'm understanding in the book that I'm reading. And what the term used for these substances that these Dionysians used to take, or the Dionysian mysteries the people used to take, whereas the proper word was actually pharmakon. So it was actually pharma. So it's actually more of a like a medicinal purpose to it. So that makes more sense when you read it literally that way. So really interesting, because obviously certain people were using it, benefiting from the properties that these things could offer to us. But again, I believe we still have to make an emphasis on the fine line between, like, going overboard, whether it be, doing it ceremonially, or going overboard, doing it celebratorily, and so on and so forth. So yeah, super interesting topic, and it's something that can be debated again for a couple more hours. But
Absolutely.
and that brings me to another one, maybe the last question that we have here, which would be, are there any certain type of psychedelic substances that are more commonly associated with celebration?
The two main ones I would think and immediately associate with celebration um, would be, of course, the mushrooms and the acid. And for the same reason, they are very similar chemically. They work on the same receptors, the serotonin receptors. The psilocybin mushrooms break the psilocybin in your body gets broken down into psilocin, as we all know, which is the actual active compound, and the lysergic acid in LSD breaks down to a very similar molecule. So those, they give you the body high, the everything feels good, it gives you the euphoria, it gives you the music sounds amazing, and the colors and the visuals are really pretty. So those are great for the celebration. Second tier celebration compounds, I'd probably go with MDMA. Not my personal favorite, but a lot of people seem to like that. That was very popular in the rave scene. MDMA, Molly, ecstasy, all that type of thing. And there's definitely some psychedelics I would recommend not to use recreationally, and I don't think they would fit real well into the celebratory, into the party, the rave scene, being specifically ayahuasca. Nobody can party on ayahuasca, and if you can, let me know.
Yeah, I don't think that's possible.
And also DMT. DMT is not a party drug at all, simply because it's so short acting, and while you're on it, this world doesn't exist, so you're not really interacting with the music and the colors and the lights and the sounds. So those I really wouldn't recommend as quote unquote party drugs.
Right, and it's very fascinating because, again, you're bringing up a very valid point, which is like, how can we have the enjoyment of both aspects? Obviously, the therapeutic aspect, if I speak for myself, has been nothing but life changing, and also it brings you to a state of awareness that you cannot compare, even if you've done like 20 years of psychotherapy. And to be honest with you, I think the therapeutic aspect is par none a very needed aspect, especially in our day and age right now, where there's a lot of problems in the world, and anxiety issues and stresses. However, I'm also of the factor where I totally understand the perspective of maybe the celebratory recreational aspect, and all the benefits that it could bring. Like, I know for a fact that if I take a walk in the woods up north, and I do a little bit of mushrooms just to connect with nature, and really the colors popping out, the surfaces being really, really, really much more interesting to the touch, like when you're touching a tree or a rock or the ground or leaves. It's really interesting, that aspect, and it really connects you and gives you a certain sense of happiness. So it's not all like anxiety situations and stress, like kind of management. It really is more, let's enjoy the planet's got to offer, and let's just have a good time. But again, I think it's very, very fine line, and we'd have to put in a disclaimer here to specify that these are not substances to be taken for fun, just because I think everything, like anything, has to be studied and analyzed and really looked thoroughly and really understand it to the degree where you're ready. It's just like driving a car. You've never driven a car. You're not gonna grab the keys, put it in the ignition, and drive away. You can cause an accident. So you have to study it. You have to learn it. You have to practice it, and eventually you get good enough where you can, get into a NASCAR race and possibly win.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think that was an amazing insight. I believe that it's a very fine line. It's a very interesting topic and probably something to be debated upon. And I look forward to more conversations of this type. And yeah, thank you again for your time. And let's do this again.
Yes, thank you for having me. I look forward to it.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
We extend our heartfelt gratitude to each and every one of you, dear listeners, for embarking on this profound, enlightening, and transformative odyssey through the realm of psychedelics. Today, we've been exploring the art of celebrating with these extraordinary plants, understanding how they can bring joy, connections, and awe-inspiring experiences into our lives. As we bid adieu, let us be mindful that exploration and curiosity pave the way for astonishing discoveries. Yet, we must always approach the psychedelics with the utmost respect and consciousness. Until we meet again, continue your inner exploration, embracing the magic and wonder of each psychedelic encounter that graces your path. Safe journey to all.